The moment Sarah Mitchell heard her father-in-law screaming at her 2-year-old son, calling him a genetic mistake and demanding she put him away before he embarrassed the family any further, she realized their relationship was about to explode in ways she never imagined. What Thomas Brennan didn't know was that little Michael's grandfather on his mother's side wasn't just any ordinary man. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Colonel James Harrison was a decorated 4-star Pentagon General, a board-certified pediatric neurosurgeon, and someone who had spent 30 years of his military career developing revolutionary treatments for children with developmental disabilities. Thomas was about to discover that attacking a disabled child in this family meant declaring war on one of the most influential and strategically brilliant minds in military medicine. The foundation of this family catastrophe had been constructed years before Michael was even conceived. Sarah had always understood that her husband David's father, Thomas Brennan, was a ruthless man. As the founder and CEO of Brennan Industries, a massive automotive parts manufacturing empire headquartered in Detroit, he had built his fortune through an unforgiving business philosophy that eliminated weakness at every level. His corporate motto, displayed in bronze letters across every facility he owned, read simply, "Perfection or nothing." This philosophy had generated a business empire worth over $80 million, with manufacturing plants across the Midwest and government contracts supplying specialized components for military vehicles. But the same relentless pursuit of perfection that had made Thomas Brennan wealthy had also made him completely incapable of accepting anything he perceived as flawed, especially when it touched his carefully curated family legacy. David's childhood had been a comprehensive education in conditional acceptance. Every grade that wasn't perfect was evidence of insufficient effort. Every athletic performance that fell short of excellence was proof of fundamental character defects. When David graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern University with a degree in biomedical engineering, his father's response was predictably harsh. Instead of celebration, Thomas expressed bewilderment that his son would waste his intelligence on healing broken people instead of building something profitable and lasting. When David married Sarah Chen, a brilliant pediatric physical therapist whose passion for helping children with disabilities matched his own, Thomas saw it as confirmation of his son's inexplicable attraction to weakness and mediocrity. Sarah's mixed Chinese-American heritage added another layer to Thomas's disapproval, though he was careful to couch his prejudice in concerns about cultural compatibility rather than outright racism. The warning signs had been visible throughout Sarah's pregnancy. Thomas made repeated comments about hoping the baby would be normal, as if disability were some kind of moral failing rather than a biological reality. When the 20-week ultrasound revealed markers suggesting potential cerebral palsy, his reaction was swift and calculating. He immediately began researching institutional care facilities, presenting Sarah and David with brochures for residential programs, before they had even processed the diagnosis themselves. Thomas treated Michael's potential disability not as a medical condition requiring support, but as a business problem requiring efficient management and containment. Sarah and David chose to approach Michael's diagnosis with hope and preparation, researching early intervention programs and connecting with specialists who could maximize their son's potential. But Thomas withdrew his support entirely, treating the remainder of the pregnancy like a countdown to inevitable disappointment rather than the anticipation of his first grandchild. Michael David Brennan entered the world on a snowy February morning at Chicago Memorial Hospital, where David worked as a biomedical research coordinator. Despite the cerebral palsy diagnosis, he was beautiful in every way that mattered to his parents. His tiny hands moved with purposeful intention, his dark eyes tracked faces with obvious intelligence, and when he smiled, it transformed the entire hospital room into something magical. The medical team at Chicago Memorial rallied around the young family with expertise and compassion, providing immediate access to early intervention specialists and developmental therapists who understood how to maximize outcomes for children with Michael's condition. But the person who should have been most supportive remained conspicuously absent from these crucial early weeks. Thomas Brennan found increasingly creative excuses to avoid meeting his grandson, citing urgent business trips and manufacturing crises that became transparently manufactured as the months passed. His absence was particularly striking given his usual involvement in family matters that he considered important to his legacy and public image. The contrast with Sarah's family could not have been more dramatic. Colonel James Harrison had flown in from Washington, D.C. within hours of Michael's birth, and his response to the cerebral palsy diagnosis was everything a grandfather should be. Rather than seeing limitations, he saw challenges to overcome. Rather than focusing on deficits, he celebrated every small victory and milestone. His medical background meant he understood cerebral palsy better than most family members in similar situations, and he immediately began connecting Sarah and David with cutting-edge specialists, innovative therapy programs, and research studies that could benefit Michael's development. He approached Michael's care with the same strategic precision that had made him legendary in military medical circles, but with the unconditional love that made him an extraordinary grandfather. For 2 years, this delicate balance held. Sarah managed to maintain a relationship with Thomas through carefully orchestrated visits, where Michael's disability could be minimized or overlooked entirely. She learned to schedule meetings during his nap times, to focus conversations on his physical growth rather than his developmental delays, and to present only the most optimistic updates about his progress and potential. It was exhausting emotional labor, but Sarah hoped that time and exposure would gradually soften Thomas's heart, that witnessing Michael's obvious intelligence and affection would overcome his prejudice and fear of imperfection. The illusion shattered completely on a humid July afternoon, during what was supposed to be a celebration of Michael's remarkable progress. He had just begun using a specialized communication device that allowed him to express complex thoughts, despite his speech limitations, a breakthrough that represented months of intensive therapy and determination. Sarah was overflowing with pride and had invited Thomas to witness this incredible achievement that proved Michael's cognitive abilities were far beyond what his physical limitations might suggest. She had spent the entire morning preparing Michael's favorite sensory activities, arranging his communication device for optimal demonstration, and rehearsing in her mind how she would share this joyous milestone with his grandfather. Thomas arrived at their modest colonial home in Evanston, carrying his usual air of barely concealed impatience and obligation, his expensive suit and luxury watch seeming out of place in the child-proofed living room filled with adaptive equipment and colorful therapy tools. When Michael used his device to clearly communicate his excitement about seeing his grandfather, forming complete sentences that demonstrated sophisticated thinking and emotional awareness, Sarah expected at least a moment of recognition for this extraordinary achievement. Instead, she watched Thomas's expression harden into something approaching disgust and revulsion, as if Michael's success somehow made his disability more offensive rather than less limiting. Thomas Brennan's inability to accept imperfection hadn't developed overnight. It was the product of a childhood spent in the shadow of his own father's relentless expectations and a business philosophy that had been forged in the unforgiving world of military contracting during the Cold War era. Growing up in a working-class Irish family in South Boston, Thomas had watched his father struggle to keep a small machine shop afloat, while larger corporations consistently undercut their bids and squeezed their profit margins. The lesson young Thomas absorbed wasn't about resilience or adaptability. It was about the necessity of being stronger, faster, and more ruthless than everyone else if you wanted to survive. When Thomas founded Brennan Industries in 1987 with a single government contract to produce specialized transmission components for military vehicles, he implemented a corporate culture that reflected his deepest beliefs about success and failure. Employees who couldn't meet impossibly high standards were eliminated without ceremony. Quality control processes were so stringent that entire production runs would be scrapped if a single component failed to meet specifications that exceeded government requirements. This approach had generated extraordinary success. Brennan Industries held exclusive contracts with the Department of Defense worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Their components were installed in vehicles used by elite military units across multiple branches of service. Thomas had built a reputation for delivering products that never failed under the most extreme conditions imaginable. But the same perfectionist mindset that made his business legendary had infected every aspect of his personal relationships. Thomas's first marriage had ended when his wife couldn't cope with his constant criticism of her social skills and appearance. His second marriage lasted longer, but only because David's mother, Patricia, had learned to avoid any behavior that might trigger his disapproval. Patricia Brennan had spent 25 years walking on eggshells, ensuring that every dinner party was flawlessly executed, every public appearance was perfectly coordinated, and every aspect of their family life projected the image of success that Thomas demanded. She had died of a heart attack at 53, and while the official cause was genetic predisposition, those who knew the family understood that decades of stress and suppressed anxiety had contributed to her early death. David's upbringing had been a masterclass in performance under pressure. His childhood home was a museum of achievement, with display cases showcasing every trophy, medal, and certificate he had earned. But each accomplishment was immediately followed by expectations for greater success. A 95% on an exam generated questions about the missing 5%. A second-place finish in a swimming competition prompted lectures about the mental weakness that prevented champions from emerging. The psychological toll had been enormous. David had developed anxiety disorders that required medication throughout high school and college. He had learned to fear failure so intensely that he sometimes avoided attempting challenges where success wasn't guaranteed. His relationship with his father was built on a foundation of conditional approval that could be withdrawn without warning if his performance fell below Thomas's arbitrary standards. When David chose biomedical engineering over business administration, Thomas interpreted it as a deliberate rejection of family values and financial responsibility. The decision to focus on pediatric applications rather than lucrative industrial contracts was seen as evidence that David lacked the killer instinct necessary for real success. Thomas had spent years trying to convince his son to join Brennan Industries, offering increasingly generous financial incentives that David consistently declined. Sarah's introduction to the family had been a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to win Thomas's approval through strategic presentation of her credentials and accomplishments. She had researched his business interests, learned about his military contracts, and prepared talking points that emphasized her practical skills and professional achievements. The effort was exhausting and ultimately futile, as Thomas remained convinced that any woman who chose to work with disabled children was fundamentally flawed in her priorities and judgment. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The early warning signs during Sarah's pregnancy had been both subtle and unmistakable. Thomas had begun suggesting names that reflected strength and traditional masculinity, as if the right choice could influence the child's development. He had purchased expensive baby clothes and equipment, but only items that projected normalcy and conventional success. When Sarah mentioned attending prenatal classes that included information about developmental disabilities, Thomas's response was swift and harsh. He had lectured her about the dangers of focusing on negative possibilities, claiming that expecting problems could somehow cause them to manifest. His suggestion that they should avoid disability propaganda and focus on ensuring a healthy birth revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of how developmental conditions actually occurred. Thomas believed that sufficient wealth and determination could prevent any kind of genetic or developmental variation from affecting his family. The ultrasound appointment that revealed Michael's condition had been scheduled during one of Thomas's business trips, a coincidence that Sarah later realized might have been deliberate. When David called to share the news, Thomas's initial response was silence, followed by questions about the reliability of the testing and the possibility of diagnostic errors. His immediate pivot to researching institutional care facilities revealed how quickly he had moved from denial to damage control. Thomas's research into residential programs had been conducted with the same methodical precision he applied to business decisions. He had compiled detailed spreadsheets comparing costs, services, and geographical locations of facilities that specialized in children with developmental disabilities. His presentations to Sarah and David included financial projections, quality assessments, and strategic arguments about why institutional care would be better for everyone involved. The most disturbing aspect of Thomas's planning was his focus on maintaining family reputation and social standing. He had researched how other wealthy families had handled similar situations, studying public relations strategies and legal frameworks that could minimize the impact on the Brennan family brand. Thomas was treating Michael's disability not as a medical condition requiring love and support, but as a corporate crisis requiring strategic management and public relations damage control. His attempts to influence Sarah and David's decisions had become increasingly aggressive as Michael's birth approached. Phone calls that began with expressions of concern would quickly escalate into lectures about responsibility and practical considerations. Thomas had even arranged meetings with his attorney to discuss trust structures that could provide financial support for institutional care while protecting the family's assets from potential long-term care costs. The pattern of behavior that emerged during these months revealed Thomas's core beliefs about human worth and family loyalty. His love was entirely conditional on performance and public presentation. His support was contingent on decisions that aligned with his vision of success and respectability. Michael's disability represented everything Thomas had spent his life trying to eliminate: unpredictability, imperfection, and circumstances that couldn't be controlled through wealth or determination. Sarah had tried to bridge the gap between Thomas's expectations and Michael's reality through careful management of information and interactions. She had learned to emphasize Michael's physical growth and downplay his developmental challenges. She had focused conversations on his medical care rather than his long-term prognosis. She had presented every therapy session and specialist appointment as evidence of progress rather than acknowledgement of ongoing needs. This emotional labor had been exhausting and ultimately unsustainable, but Sarah had convinced herself that patience and persistence would eventually overcome Thomas's prejudices. She believed that witnessing Michael's personality and intelligence would gradually change his grandfather's perspective, transforming fear and rejection into acceptance and love. The strategy had seemed to be working during the first 2 years of Michael's life. Thomas's visits became more frequent, his interactions with Michael grew less stilted, and his questions about developmental milestones suggested genuine interest rather than mere obligation. Sarah had interpreted these changes as signs that his heart was softening and his capacity for unconditional love was finally emerging. But what Sarah didn't understand was that Thomas had been conducting his own evaluation of Michael's condition and prognosis. His apparent acceptance had been a form of research, gathering information that would inform his ultimate decision about the family's future. The breakthrough with Michael's communication device hadn't represented hope to Thomas. It had represented a threat to his carefully constructed plans for managing the situation. The explosion came without any warning that Sarah could have anticipated. Michael had been demonstrating his new communication abilities with obvious pride, using his device to form complete sentences about his favorite activities, and his excitement about showing his grandfather what he had learned. The technology allowed him to express thoughts that his physical limitations had previously kept locked inside, revealing an intelligence and emotional depth that amazed everyone who witnessed it. Sarah watched her father-in-law's face as Michael carefully selected symbols and words to create the message. "Grandpa Thomas, I love you and I want to show you my new pictures." The sentence had taken Michael several minutes to construct, his small fingers working deliberately across the screen, but the final result was clear, heartfelt, and undeniably sophisticated for a 2-year-old with any kind of developmental difference. Instead of the pride or even simple acknowledgement Sarah had hoped for, Thomas's expression shifted through a series of emotions that made her stomach clench with growing dread. First came surprise, as if he hadn't expected Michael to be capable of such communication. Then confusion, as if the child's obvious intelligence somehow made his physical limitations more offensive rather than less significant. Finally, his face settled into an expression of cold calculation that Sarah had seen him use when evaluating business problems that required decisive action. Michael, sensing the tension but not understanding its source, began making the happy vocalizations that accompanied his communication device use. These sounds were his natural expression of joy and excitement, the audio equivalent of a smile that filled the room with his enthusiasm for sharing this breakthrough moment with his grandfather. To Sarah's ears, these sounds were music, evidence of her son's engagement with the world and his desire to connect with the people he loved. But Thomas's reaction suggested he heard something entirely different. His jaw tightened as Michael's vocalizations grew louder and more enthusiastic. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. His breathing became shallow and rapid, as if he were struggling to maintain control over emotions that were building toward an explosion. The silence that followed Michael's happy sounds was thick with menace. Then Thomas erupted with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep and poisonous within him. His voice, when it finally emerged, was loud enough to shake the windows and sharp enough to cut through every protective barrier Sarah had built around her family's peace. The words he used would replay in her mind for months afterward, each syllable a fresh assault on everything she believed about family loyalty and unconditional love. He called Michael a genetic mistake, as if her son's cerebral palsy were some kind of manufacturing defect rather than a medical condition that affected millions of children worldwide. He said the boy was an embarrassment to the Brennan family name, as if his disability somehow diminished the accomplishments of previous generations, rather than representing another kind of human diversity that required support and understanding. But the most devastating moment came when Thomas pointed directly at Michael and declared that the child needed to be put away in an institution before he could contaminate any future grandchildren with his defective genes. His use of the word contaminate revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about cerebral palsy and his complete absence of any protective instinct toward his own grandson. Michael's response to his grandfather's sudden shouting was entirely normal for a 2-year-old who had been startled by loud, angry voices. He began to cry. Not the manipulative crying of a child seeking attention, but the genuine distress of someone who sensed danger without understanding its source. His tears were immediate and heartbroken, accompanied by the kind of sobbing that indicated real fear and confusion. Thomas interpreted Michael's crying as validation of his cruel assessment rather than recognition of his own role in creating the distress. He pointed at the crying child and announced that this was exactly why children like Michael shouldn't be kept at home, that they were too disruptive and emotionally unstable for normal family environments. The irony was completely lost on him. His own screaming had created the very situation he was using to justify his prejudice. The communication device lay forgotten on the floor where it had fallen when Michael recoiled from his grandfather's attack. The screen still displayed his loving message to Thomas, the words, "I love you," glowing softly while the child who had crafted them sobbed in terror and confusion. The contrast between Michael's innocent attempt at connection and his grandfather's brutal rejection was so stark that it seemed to summarize everything wrong with Thomas's approach to family relationships. Sarah's protective instincts activated with a force that surprised even her. She moved without conscious thought, scooping Michael into her arms and feeling his small body tremble against her chest, while his tears soaked through her shirt. The weight of him, so familiar and precious, seemed to anchor her to what mattered most while everything else in the room spiraled into chaos and cruelty. Something fundamental shifted in Sarah's relationship with Thomas at that moment. This wasn't about different parenting philosophies or varying approaches to disability accommodation. This was about a grown man using words as weapons against a defenseless child who had just been trying to share his joy and love with someone he trusted. Thomas had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, attacking not just Michael's disability but his very right to exist as part of the family. David had been in the kitchen preparing snacks when the explosion occurred, but he reached the living room in time to witness his father's final, most damaging statements. His face went white as he processed what he was seeing. His own father verbally attacking his 2-year-old son, with language that would have been cruel if directed at an adult enemy, but was absolutely inexcusable when targeted at a vulnerable child. The immediate aftermath was a blur of shouted accusations and defensive justifications. Thomas seemed genuinely surprised by the intensity of Sarah and David's reactions, as if he had expected them to appreciate his honest assessment of the situation. He appeared to believe that his wealth and business success gave him the authority to make pronouncements about family members' worth and future prospects. When David demanded that his father apologize to Michael and leave their home immediately, Thomas's response revealed the full extent of his disconnection from normal human empathy. He refused to apologize for what he characterized as telling the truth about a difficult situation, claiming that someone needed to have the courage to address the family's long-term challenges honestly and practically. His final ultimatum exceeded even Sarah's worst expectations of his capacity for cruelty. Thomas informed them that unless they made arrangements to place Michael in appropriate residential care within 60 days, they could consider themselves completely cut off from the Brennan family fortune and business empire. No more financial support for David's research projects, no inheritance, no family relationships of any kind. He seemed to genuinely believe that this threat would bring Sarah and David to heel, that their fear of losing his financial support would override their parental instincts and protective love for their son. Thomas had spent so many years using money as a tool for controlling behavior that he couldn't imagine anyone choosing love over financial security, especially when the choice involved what he considered a defective child. But Thomas had made a critical miscalculation in his assessment of the family dynamics. His ultimatum wasn't just a threat against Sarah and David. It was a declaration of war against people who had their own powerful allies and resources. While he had been focused on the immediate family members he could intimidate and control, he had completely overlooked the broader network of relationships that surrounded and protected Michael. Most importantly, Thomas had no idea that his attack on Michael would reach the ears of Colonel James Harrison within hours of his departure from their home. Sarah's father was landing at O'Hare International Airport for his scheduled monthly visit with his beloved grandson, expecting to spend a peaceful weekend watching Michael play and celebrating his latest developmental achievements. Instead, he would walk into a home filled with tension and trauma, where his daughter was still comforting her sobbing son, and his son-in-law was pacing the living room with fury radiating from every muscle. The story Sarah would tell him over the next hour would transform Colonel Harrison from loving grandfather into strategic mastermind, a military leader who had spent decades protecting American interests, but had never faced a mission as personal or as important as defending his grandson from the cruelty of his own family members. Colonel James Harrison stepped through the front door of his daughter's home and immediately sensed that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The atmosphere was thick with residual tension, and Sarah's eyes were red from tears she was still struggling to control. Michael sat quietly in his mother's lap, uncharacteristically subdued for a child who usually greeted his grandfather with explosive enthusiasm and joyful vocalizations. David paced the living room like a caged animal, his movements sharp and agitated in ways that reminded the colonel of soldiers who had witnessed atrocities they couldn't yet process. The communication device lay abandoned on the carpet, its screen dark and forgotten in a corner where it had apparently been hastily pushed aside during some kind of confrontation. Sarah's account of Thomas's attack unfolded over the next 90 minutes, with the colonel asking precise, strategic questions that revealed his decades of experience in gathering intelligence and assessing threats. He requested specific details about Thomas's exact words, the sequence of events leading to the confrontation, and the nature of the ultimatum that had been delivered. His note-taking was meticulous, documenting every element of the incident with the thoroughness of someone building a comprehensive case file. But what transformed Colonel Harrison from concerned grandfather into strategic mastermind wasn't just the cruelty of Thomas's words. It was the recognition that this attack represented a pattern of discrimination that extended far beyond one family's dysfunction. As a pediatric neurosurgeon who had spent 30 years treating children with developmental disabilities, he understood exactly how family rejection could devastate a child's long-term outcomes and psychological development. More importantly, as a Pentagon General with extensive connections throughout military medicine and federal healthcare policy, Colonel Harrison recognized that Thomas Brennan's attitudes weren't isolated personal failings. They were symptomatic of broader institutional biases that affected thousands of disabled children and their families across the country. This wasn't just about protecting Michael. It was about creating systemic changes that would benefit vulnerable children nationwide. The colonel's first phone call was to his chief aide at the Pentagon, Major Patricia Wong, who had been coordinating his grandfather's visits and was familiar with the family's situation through her management of his personal schedule. Within 24 hours, Major Wong had initiated a discreet inquiry into Brennan Industries' compliance with federal disability accommodations laws, particularly focusing on their government contracts and workplace accessibility standards. The inquiry was perfectly legal and entirely appropriate, triggered by concerns about whether companies receiving substantial Department of Defense contracts were adhering to Americans with Disabilities Act requirements in their facilities and employment practices. The timing was strategic rather than coincidental, but the investigation itself was conducted through proper channels with legitimate regulatory authority. Colonel Harrison's next series of calls activated a network of relationships he had built over 3 decades of military service and medical practice. His contacts included federal prosecutors who specialized in civil rights violations, disability advocacy organizations that had been seeking high-profile test cases, and medical researchers who understood the connection between family support and developmental outcomes for children with cerebral palsy. Dr. Angela Martinez, the colonel's longtime colleague and one of the country's leading pediatric neurologists, had been documenting cases of family dysfunction around childhood disability for a comprehensive study on environmental factors that influenced treatment outcomes. Thomas's attack on Michael provided exactly the kind of detailed case study that could illustrate how discrimination within families often reflected and reinforced broader social prejudices against disabled individuals. The strategic brilliance of Colonel Harrison's approach became apparent as the multiple tracks of his response began to converge. Rather than seeking simple revenge against Thomas Brennan, he was building a comprehensive framework that would transform Michael's personal trauma into evidence for policy changes, legal precedents, and professional training programs that could protect thousands of other vulnerable children. The investigation into Brennan Industries revealed systematic patterns of accessibility violations that suggested deliberate policy rather than accidental oversight. Federal facilities constructed by the company showed consistent problems with wheelchair accessibility, bathroom accommodations, and parking spaces that didn't meet ADA standards. More significantly, internal company documents obtained through the investigation revealed a corporate culture that consistently minimized the importance of disability accommodations. Employee testimonies collected during the federal inquiry painted a disturbing picture of workplace attitudes that mirrored Thomas's personal prejudices. Workers reported being instructed to find ways to reduce accessibility compliance costs, with supervisors referring to disability accommodations as expensive government red tape that interfered with profit margins. The language used in internal company communications was remarkably similar to the cruel words Thomas had directed at his own grandson. Colonel Harrison had also begun reaching out to his extensive network within the disability advocacy community, organizations that had been waiting for the right opportunity to challenge systematic discrimination in government contracting. The Brennan Industries case provided exactly the kind of high-profile example they needed to demonstrate how personal attitudes toward disability often translated into institutional barriers that affected entire communities. Dr. Robert Chen, director of the National Institute for Developmental Disabilities Research, had agreed to document Michael's case as part of a longitudinal study tracking how family support or rejection influenced long-term outcomes for children with cerebral palsy. The research would follow Michael's development over several years, using his progress as evidence of what became possible when children received appropriate medical care and unconditional family love. The most sophisticated element of Colonel Harrison's strategy involved his connections within military medical research programs that were developing cutting-edge treatments for traumatic brain injuries and neurological conditions. Michael's cerebral palsy made him eligible for experimental therapy programs that were typically available only to military personnel and their families, treatments that could potentially improve his motor function and communication abilities far beyond current expectations. Access to these programs would not only benefit Michael directly, but would also create documentation of his remarkable progress that could be used to challenge traditional assumptions about developmental limitations in children with cerebral palsy. The contrast between his potential achievements and his grandfather's cruel assessment would become increasingly stark as the research progressed. Colonel Harrison's approach to media relations was equally strategic. Rather than seeking immediate publicity that might appear vindictive, He had begun building relationships with journalists who specialized in healthcare policy and civil rights issues. When the Brennan Industries investigation became public, these reporters would have context about the broader implications of the case beyond simple business violations. The timing of these various initiatives was carefully coordinated to create maximum impact while maintaining the appearance of independent investigations and policy developments. Thomas Brennan would find himself facing multiple challenges simultaneously: federal contract reviews, civil rights scrutiny, media attention, and professional isolation, without being able to identify a single source or motivation for his problems. Most importantly, Colonel Harrison had begun documenting Thomas's threats and ultimatums with the same precision he applied to military intelligence gathering. The 60-day deadline for institutionalizing Michael wasn't just a cruel family demand, it was potential evidence of attempted coercion that could be relevant in custody proceedings or civil rights litigation if Thomas tried to interfere with his grandson's care. Hail! The foundation that would eventually bear Michael's name was already taking shape in Colonel Harrison's strategic planning, though Sarah and David weren't yet aware of the full scope of what their family's trauma would ultimately create. The organization would provide legal advocacy for families facing disability discrimination, fund research into developmental interventions, and train professionals to recognize and respond to family dysfunction around childhood disability. Every program the foundation would eventually support, every lawsuit it would fund, and every policy change it would advocate would carry Michael's story as evidence of both the potential for positive outcomes when children received appropriate support, and the devastating consequences when families failed to provide unconditional love and acceptance. As Colonel Harrison concluded his initial strategic planning session with Sarah and David, he made them a promise that would prove prophetic over the coming months. Thomas Brennan had declared war on the wrong family, attacking a child who was protected by one of the most connected and strategically brilliant military medical officers in the country. The grandfather who had called Michael a genetic mistake was about to discover that his cruelty would be transformed into a catalyst for systematic changes that would benefit disabled children for generations. The first cracks in Thomas Brennan's empire appeared exactly 3 weeks after his attack on Michael, when a routine compliance inspection at his primary manufacturing facility in Dearborn uncovered accessibility violations that federal investigators characterized as, quote, systematic and extensive. The inspection team, led by Senior Compliance Officer Janet Rodriguez, documented wheelchair ramps that exceeded maximum slope requirements, employee parking areas without designated accessible spaces, and bathroom facilities that failed to meet dimensional standards required by federal law. What made these violations particularly damaging wasn't their individual severity, but the pattern they revealed when investigators expanded their review to include all federal facilities constructed by Brennan Industries over the past decade. Military housing complexes, Department of Defense administrative buildings, and specialized vehicle maintenance facilities showed consistent problems that suggested deliberate cost-cutting measures rather than accidental oversights. The investigation team discovered internal company emails that provided disturbing insight into Brennan Industries' approach to accessibility requirements. Construction supervisors had been instructed to find, quote, creative solutions for meeting ADA compliance that minimized additional costs and construction delays. Project managers routinely referred to accessibility features as, quote, government extras that interfered with efficient construction timelines and profit margins. Most damaging were communications from Thomas himself, including a company-wide memo from 2 years earlier that instructed department heads to focus on core construction requirements rather than getting bogged down in specialized accommodations that serve minimal populations. His language in these business documents echoed the contempt he had expressed toward his own grandson, revealing that his personal prejudices had infected every level of his company's operations. The federal investigation expanded rapidly as Inspector General Patricia Walsh recognized the potential scope of the compliance failures. Her office had been seeking a high-profile case that could demonstrate the importance of accessibility enforcement in government contracting, and Brennan Industries provided exactly the kind of systematic violations that justified comprehensive review and significant penalties. Within 6 weeks, Thomas found himself facing contract suspensions that represented nearly 60% of his company's annual revenue. The Department of Defense had placed all Brennan Industries projects under administrative hold pending completion of the accessibility review, effectively freezing payments for work already completed and preventing new contract awards until compliance issues were resolved. The financial impact was immediate and severe. Brennan Industries employed over 800 workers across multiple facilities, with payroll obligations that exceeded $2 million monthly. The company's credit lines, which had been secured based on guaranteed government contracts, were suddenly in jeopardy as banks reassessed the risk profile of lending to a contractor under federal investigation. Thomas's attempts to contain the damage through political connections and industry relationships proved surprisingly ineffective. Former allies in the defense contracting community began distancing themselves from Brennan Industries to protect their own government relationships. Trade association meetings that had once been networking opportunities became sources of professional isolation as other contractors worried about guilt by association. The media coverage was relentless and uniformly negative. Detroit Business Journal ran a front-page investigation titled "Building Barriers: How One Contractor's Shortcuts Left Disabled Americans Behind," featuring photographs of inaccessible entrances at federal buildings and interviews with disabled veterans who had struggled to navigate facilities constructed by Thomas's company. Channel 7 News aired a week-long series examining accessibility failures in government construction, with Brennan Industries featured as the primary case study in systematic non-compliance. The investigative team had obtained internal company documents through Freedom of Information requests, revealing the callous language Thomas and his supervisors had used when discussing disability accommodations. The most damaging television segment featured interviews with former Brennan Industries employees who described a corporate culture that consistently devalued accessibility concerns. Construction workers reported being ridiculed for raising compliance questions, with supervisors claiming that normal people could adapt to minor accessibility challenges and that extensive accommodations were wasteful government overreach. Thomas watched his professional reputation disintegrate in real time as each news report reinforced the narrative that his company had deliberately discriminated against disabled Americans to maximize profits. The contrast between his public image as a successful businessman and the emerging picture of systematic discrimination was devastating to his carefully cultivated brand. Meanwhile, Michael's development was accelerating in ways that seemed almost designed to contradict his grandfather's cruel assessment. Dr. Angela Martinez had begun working directly with Michael's therapy team, introducing innovative communication technologies and motor development techniques that were producing remarkable results. His progress was being documented with scientific rigor as part of the longitudinal research study that would eventually influence treatment approaches nationwide. The experimental therapy programs available through Colonel Harrison's military medical connections were proving even more effective than anticipated. Michael's participation in cutting-edge neuroplasticity research was generating data that challenged traditional assumptions about developmental potential in children with cerebral palsy. His cognitive assessments consistently exceeded expectations, while his communication abilities were expanding at rates that amazed his medical team. Dr. Robert Chen's research documentation was creating a powerful contrast between Michael's thriving development and his grandfather's characterization of him as a genetic mistake. The scientific literature was beginning to include references to Michael's case as evidence of what became possible when children with disabilities received appropriate family support and access to advanced medical interventions. The Detroit Disability Rights Coalition had received an anonymous donation of $500,000 to fund a comprehensive investigation into construction industry accessibility compliance throughout the Midwest. The timing of this donation, just weeks after Thomas's attack on Michael, enabled the organization to hire additional investigators and legal advocates who could challenge systematic discrimination across multiple sectors. Coalition Director Maria Santos had been a disability rights attorney for 15 years, representing families and individuals who faced discrimination in employment, housing, and public accommodations. When her organization received funding to investigate construction industry practices, she immediately recognized the opportunity to create legal precedents that would benefit disabled Americans nationwide. The coalition's investigation quickly expanded beyond Brennan Industries to examine accessibility compliance across the entire defense contracting sector. Their research revealed that Thomas's company wasn't unique in cutting corners on disability accommodations, but it was among the most egregious violators of federal requirements. The pattern of systematic discrimination suggested industry-wide problems that required comprehensive regulatory response. Legal advocacy organizations across the country began coordinating their efforts to maximize the impact of the Brennan Industries case. The National Association of Disability Rights Attorneys had identified multiple potential lawsuits that could be filed on behalf of disabled individuals who had been harmed by accessibility violations at facilities constructed by Thomas's company. Federal prosecutors were also taking notice of the case, with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice reviewing whether criminal charges might be appropriate for the most serious accessibility violations. The deliberate nature of the compliance failures, combined with evidence of discriminatory intent in internal company communications, suggested possible violations of federal civil rights statutes that carried criminal penalties. Thomas's personal life was becoming as isolated as his professional relationships. Country club memberships that had once provided social connection and business networking opportunities were quietly terminated as organizations sought to avoid association with someone under federal civil rights investigation. Former friends and business associates began declining social invitations and avoiding public events where they might be photographed with Thomas. His luxury lifestyle, funded by decades of cutting corners on accessibility requirements, was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as legal expenses mounted and revenue streams disappeared. The mansion in Birmingham Hills that had hosted elaborate parties and business entertaining was now primarily occupied by attorneys, accountants, and crisis management consultants who were trying to salvage what remained of his empire. The irony of Thomas's situation was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone except Thomas himself. His cruel attack on Michael had triggered investigations that revealed systematic discrimination affecting thousands of disabled Americans. His attempt to isolate his grandson from family support had instead connected Michael to a network of medical professionals and advocates who were maximizing his developmental potential, while using his story to create positive changes for other vulnerable children. Most significantly, Thomas remained completely unaware that his business crisis had been orchestrated by the grandfather he had dismissed as merely his daughter-in-law's father. Colonel Harrison's strategic planning was unfolding with military precision, but Thomas continued to view his problems as mysterious coincidences rather than coordinated consequences of his discriminatory choices. The investigation was far from over, and the mounting consequences were building toward a public reckoning that would expose not just Thomas's business practices, but his personal cruelty toward his disabled grandson. The man who had called Michael a genetic mistake was about to discover that his own moral failures would be preserved in legal documents, academic research, and policy discussions that would outlast anything his construction company had ever built. The trap closed with devastating precision on a crisp October morning during the National Conference on Pediatric Developmental Medicine in Chicago, an event that Thomas Brennan attended thinking he was networking to rebuild his shattered professional reputation. What he didn't know was that his personal cruelty toward Michael had become the centerpiece of a conference session titled Family Dysfunction and Childhood Disability: Recognizing and Responding to Discriminatory Attitudes in Medical Settings. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the conference program director and longtime colleague of Colonel Harrison, had designed the session with surgical precision to expose the connection between family prejudice and institutional discrimination. The conference attracted over 1,200 pediatric specialists, disability advocates, researchers, and policymakers from across the country, the very professionals who would shape treatment approaches and advocacy strategies for disabled children over the next generation. Thomas entered the main auditorium carrying his usual air of forced confidence, scanning the crowd for potential business contacts who might be willing to overlook his recent compliance problems. His expensive suit and practiced networking smile seemed pathetically out of place among medical professionals who had dedicated their careers to helping vulnerable children rather than exploiting them for profit. The session began with Dr. Angela Martinez presenting groundbreaking research on environmental factors that influenced developmental outcomes for children with cerebral palsy. Her presentation included detailed case studies demonstrating how family support or rejection could dramatically impact a child's long-term potential, with specific attention to the neuroplasticity benefits that emerged when children received unconditional love and access to appropriate interventions. Thomas sat in the darkened auditorium, initially pleased that the medical content seemed unrelated to his business problems. He had no idea that the research being presented was based partly on data from his own grandson, whose remarkable progress under Colonel Harrison's care was providing evidence that challenged traditional assumptions about developmental limitations. The atmosphere shifted dramatically when Dr. Martinez introduced a specific case study involving a 2-year-old with cerebral palsy whose grandfather had verbally attacked him during a family visit. The audience gasped audibly as she read direct quotes from the attack: "Genetic mistake, contaminate future grandchildren," and demands for institutional placement of a child who was clearly thriving in a loving home environment. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as he recognized his own words being read aloud to an audience of hundreds of medical professionals. The quotes were presented without identifying names or locations, but several attendees who had read media coverage of the Brennan Industries investigation were beginning to make connections between the family dysfunction case study and the systematic accessibility violations that had been dominating healthcare policy discussions. Dr. Robert Chen followed with a presentation on his longitudinal research tracking Michael's development, though he referred to the child only as quote, 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 quote. Quote, 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 "The research documentation showed cognitive assessments that exceeded expectations, communication breakthroughs that challenged traditional prognoses, and social development that demonstrated remarkable resilience despite early family trauma." The contrast between the grandfather's cruel assessment and the child's actual achievements was impossible to ignore. Conference attendees watched video footage of Michael using his communication device to express complex thoughts, participating enthusiastically in physical therapy sessions, and displaying the kind of joy and curiosity that contradicted every assumption underlying his grandfather's discriminatory attitudes. Colonel Harrison delivered the keynote address with the measured authority that had made him legendary in military medical circles. His presentation focused on the responsibility of medical communities to protect disabled children from discrimination, particularly when that discrimination originated within their own families. He spoke about the need for institutional responses that could transform personal trauma into systematic change. Without mentioning Thomas by name, Colonel Harrison described a recent case where a grandfather's attack on his disabled grandchild had triggered federal investigations, policy reviews, and advocacy initiatives that would benefit thousands of other vulnerable children. He explained how individual acts of cruelty could become catalysts for positive transformation when communities rallied to protect their most vulnerable members. The audience was completely absorbed by the presentation, many taking detailed notes about recognition signs of family dysfunction and intervention strategies that could protect children from discriminatory relatives. Thomas sat frozen in his seat, realizing that his attack on Michael had become a training case that would be discussed in medical schools and policy conferences for years to come. The most devastating moment came during the question and answer session, when Dr. Martinez was asked about the long-term consequences for family members who rejected disabled children. Her response, delivered with clinical precision, described research showing that discriminatory relatives typically experienced complete social isolation, professional consequences, and psychological distress that could persist for decades. She explained that communities consistently rejected adults who attacked vulnerable children, creating natural consequences that served both punishment and prevention functions. The grandfather in their case study, she noted, had lost his business, his professional relationships, and access to the grandchild he had tried to reject, while the child had thrived under the protection of advocates who understood his true value. Thomas felt hundreds of eyes scanning the auditorium as attendees processed this information. Several conference participants who recognized him from media coverage were whispering among themselves, pointing in his direction with expressions of disgust and recognition. His presence at a conference dedicated to supporting disabled children was suddenly revealed as grotesquely inappropriate. During the lunch break, Thomas found himself completely isolated, as medical professionals who might normally have engaged in polite networking conversations actively avoided any contact with him. Word had spread quickly through the conference that the grandfather featured in the morning presentations was actually present in the audience, creating a buzz of outrage and professional interest in his complete social rejection. Dr. Sarah Kim, a pediatric neurologist from Stanford, approached Thomas directly during the lunch reception, with a question that summarized the collective opinion of the medical community. She asked him how it felt to have his discriminatory attitudes used as a training example for professionals learning to protect vulnerable children from family dysfunction. Thomas's stammered response about privacy violations and legal challenges fell flat among medical professionals who understood that his own cruel words had created the very situation he was now trying to escape. His presence at the conference was generating exactly the kind of documentation and witness testimony that advocacy organizations could use in future discrimination cases. The afternoon sessions continued to feature his case prominentially, with legal advocates discussing strategies for protecting disabled children from family-based discrimination and policy experts, analyzing how individual incidents could spark broader institutional reforms. The Michael Harrison Foundation, named after his grandson and funded by Colonel Harrison's strategic network, was announced as a new organization dedicated to supporting families and challenging discrimination. Thomas realized that his escape from the conference would be as humiliating as his presence had become. Media representatives were interviewing attendees about the sessions on family dysfunction, with several asking specifically about the grandfather whose discrimination had become such a prominent case study. Leaving would require running a gauntlet of professionals who now viewed him as a symbol of everything their field worked to overcome. The conference program book, distributed to all attendees, included detailed abstracts of the presentations featuring his case. These documents would be preserved in medical libraries and research databases, ensuring that his cruelty toward Michael would be remembered not as a private family matter, but as evidence of the discrimination that enlightened medical communities worked to prevent and address. As Thomas finally fled the conference venue, he understood that his public humiliation was complete. The medical professionals who would be treating disabled children for the next generation had all witnessed his exposure as a cautionary tale. His name and actions would be associated with family dysfunction and discrimination in professional discussions that would continue long after his business empire had completely collapsed. Michael, meanwhile, was at home with Sarah, completely unaware that his grandfather's attack had become the foundation for advocacy efforts that would protect thousands of other vulnerable children. His continued development was providing ongoing evidence that love and appropriate support could overcome even the cruelest family rejection, while his story inspired systematic changes that transformed personal trauma into lasting protection for disabled children nationwide. 5 years after Thomas Brennan's devastating attack on his grandson, the world had transformed in ways that none of them could have anticipated on that terrible July afternoon. Michael Harrison Brennan, now 7 years old, had become the unwitting catalyst for changes that rippled through every level of American society's approach to disability rights, family advocacy, and institutional accountability. The Michael Harrison Foundation had evolved into one of the most influential disability advocacy organizations in the United States, with regional offices in 15 major cities and programs that served over 50,000 families annually. What had begun as Colonel Harrison's strategic response to his grandson's trauma had become a comprehensive movement that challenged discrimination wherever it emerged, in families, businesses, schools, and government institutions. Michael himself remained gloriously unaware of his role as a transformative figure in disability advocacy. His mornings were filled with advanced communication therapy sessions that had evolved far beyond the simple device Thomas had mocked. He now used sophisticated speech-generating software that translated his thoughts into clear, articulate sentences that amazed everyone who heard them. His cognitive assessments consistently placed him in gifted ranges, while his social development exceeded expectations for any 7-year-old, regardless of disability status. Dr. Angela Martinez's longitudinal research following Michael's development had been published in the most prestigious pediatric journals, fundamentally altering how medical professionals understood potential outcomes for children with cerebral palsy. Her work demonstrated that traditional limitations were often artificially imposed by social expectations rather than medical realities, with appropriate support enabling achievements that exceeded historical norms by dramatic margins. The research had attracted international attention, with medical centers in 12 countries implementing treatment protocols based on findings from Michael's case. Children with cerebral palsy in Germany, Japan, Australia, and Sweden were receiving therapies that had been developed through studying his remarkable progress, ensuring that his grandfather's cruelty had inadvertently benefited vulnerable children across the globe. Sarah had undergone perhaps the most dramatic personal transformation of anyone in the family. The woman who had once carefully managed information to avoid her father-in-law's disapproval had become a nationally recognized expert in family dysfunction around childhood disability. Her testimony before congressional committees had influenced federal legislation strengthening accessibility requirements and family protection protocols, while her speeches at medical conferences were considered essential professional development for pediatric specialists. Her book, When Families Fail: Protecting Disabled Children from Those Who Should Love Them Most, had become required reading in social work programs and family therapy training nationwide. The memoir detailed Thomas's attack on Michael with clinical precision while analyzing the broader patterns of discrimination that affected thousands of families. Thomas's own cruel words were quoted extensively throughout the text, preserved for academic posterity as examples of the prejudice that enlightened families worked to overcome. Sarah's media appearances had made her the most recognizable advocate for families dealing with disability discrimination. Television producers, podcast hosts, and documentary filmmakers regularly sought her perspective on cases involving family rejection of disabled children. Each interview reinforced the message that love and support could overcome even the cruelest discrimination, while highlighting resources available through the foundation that bore her son's name. David had channeled his trauma into groundbreaking biomedical research that was revolutionizing treatment approaches for children with developmental disabilities. His work on neuroplasticity and early intervention had received federal funding totaling over $12 million, with research protocols that incorporated lessons learned from Michael's remarkable progress. The laboratory named in Michael's honor was developing technologies that would enhance communication abilities and motor function for children with conditions similar to his. The contrast between Michael's thriving development and his grandfather's original assessment had become increasingly stark with each passing year. Videos of Michael participating in advanced therapy sessions, engaging in complex problem-solving activities, and expressing sophisticated thoughts through his communication systems were regularly featured in training materials for medical professionals learning to support children with disabilities. Thomas Brennan's empire had collapsed completely, with Brennan Industries declaring bankruptcy after 18 months of federal investigations, civil rights lawsuits, and criminal prosecutions. The company that had once employed over 800 workers and generated annual revenues exceeding $100 million was liquidated to pay regulatory penalties, legal settlements, and accessibility remediation costs at facilities he had constructed. The criminal charges against Thomas for deliberate civil rights violations had resulted in a plea agreement that included substantial fines, community service requirements, and mandatory participation in disability awareness training. He was required to complete 200 hours of volunteer work with disability advocacy organizations, though most groups declined to accept his services due to his documented history of discrimination. His personal bankruptcy had stripped away every symbol of the success that had once defined his identity. The mansion in Birmingham Hills had been sold to satisfy federal penalties. The luxury vehicles, country club memberships, and vacation properties that had represented his achievements were liquidated to pay legal fees and settlement costs. Thomas now lived in a modest apartment in a Detroit suburb, supported by Social Security payments and whatever odd jobs he could obtain from the few contractors willing to overlook his toxic reputation. The media coverage of Thomas's downfall had been extensive and uniformly negative. Business magazines analyzed his case as an example of how personal prejudices could destroy corporate success when they influence discriminatory practices. Legal journals examined his prosecution as a precedent for civil rights enforcement in government contracting. Disability advocacy publications used his story to illustrate both the potential for justice and the importance of protecting vulnerable children from family-based discrimination. Most painfully for Thomas, he was forced to witness Michael's continued success through media coverage that regularly featured his grandson's achievements, while noting that his grandfather had initially demanded his institutionalization. Every newspaper article about breakthrough research in cerebral palsy treatment mentioned Michael's remarkable progress, while explaining that his grandfather had called him a genetic mistake. Every television segment about disability advocacy highlighted the foundation's accomplishments while describing the family discrimination that had motivated its creation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh's research on the long-term consequences of disability discrimination had followed Thomas's situation with clinical interest, documenting how his rejection of Michael had resulted in complete social isolation, financial ruin, and psychological deterioration that persisted years after his initial discriminatory choices. The study provided valuable insights into how communities naturally protected vulnerable children by rejecting adults who attacked them, creating consequences that served both punishment and prevention functions. The research revealed that Thomas's experience was typical of adults who discriminated against disabled family members. Social networks consistently excluded such individuals to protect their own relationships with disability communities. Professional opportunities disappeared as businesses avoided association with people who had documented histories of discrimination. Personal relationships were contaminated by the recognition that someone who could attack a vulnerable child posed risks to other family members. Thomas's attempts at reconciliation with Sarah and Michael had been consistently rejected, with family court judges ruling that his presence posed psychological risks to Michael's continued development. The restraining order that prevented contact remained in effect, legally enforced by documentation of his verbal abuse and ongoing evidence of his failure to genuinely address his discriminatory attitudes. The Michigan Harrison Center for Pediatric Excellence had been established at the University of Michigan Medical School, funded by federal grants and private donations that had been inspired by Michael's story. The center provided comprehensive services for children with developmental disabilities while conducting research that challenged traditional assumptions about potential and limitations. Every treatment protocol developed at the center was tested against outcomes achieved in Michael's case, using his progress as a benchmark for what became possible with appropriate support. The center's training programs for medical professionals included mandatory sessions on recognizing and responding to family dysfunction around childhood disability. Thomas's attack on Michael was featured prominently in these educational materials, with his cruel words used as examples of the discrimination that medical professionals must be prepared to address and counter. The ripple effects of Michael's story had influenced policy at every level of government. The Americans with Disabilities Act had been strengthened with new enforcement mechanisms that were directly inspired by the accessibility violations discovered at Brennan Industries. Federal contracting requirements now included enhanced oversight of disability compliance, with automatic review procedures that prevented the kind of systematic discrimination that Thomas's company had practiced. State legislation in Michigan and 12 other states had established new protections for disabled children against family discrimination, with legal frameworks that enabled rapid intervention when relatives posed threats to children's emotional or physical well-being. The laws were collectively known as Michael's Protections, ensuring that his grandfather's cruelty would be remembered as the catalyst for systematic safeguards that protected thousands of other vulnerable children. International disability advocacy organizations had adopted the case as a model for how personal trauma could be transformed into institutional change. The United Nations Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities had cited Michael's story in reports calling for stronger protections against family-based discrimination, while the European Union had implemented policy changes influenced by research emerging from his case. The 7th anniversary of Thomas's attack approached with planning that reflected Michael's evolution from victim to symbol of hope and transformation. The annual Michael Harrison Foundation Gala had become one of the most significant fundraising events in the disability advocacy community, attracting celebrities, politicians, and business leaders who wanted to associate themselves with positive change and family resilience. Michael would attend the gala as the guest of honor, though his role would be carefully managed to protect his childhood while acknowledging his symbolic importance. His presence at the event would provide powerful testimony to the outcomes that became possible when communities rallied to protect vulnerable children from discrimination, even when that discrimination originated within their own families. The evening would also feature the announcement of the Foundation's international expansion, with new programs being established in 6 countries where disability discrimination remained widespread. Each program would carry Michael's name and story, ensuring that his grandfather's moment of cruelty continued to generate positive changes that protected vulnerable children worldwide. Sarah's keynote address at the gala would focus on the transformation of family trauma into systematic advocacy, highlighting how Michael's experience had created resources and protections that benefited thousands of other families facing similar challenges. Her speech would include references to Thomas's attack, but only as historical context for the positive changes that had emerged from their family's crisis. The contrast between Michael's current life and his grandfather's original vision could not have been more complete. The child Thomas had called a genetic mistake had become the inspiration for medical breakthroughs, policy changes, and advocacy efforts that were improving lives across the globe. The boy he had demanded be institutionalized was thriving in inclusive educational programs, while serving as evidence that appropriate support could enable remarkable achievements. Thomas himself would spend the anniversary as he had spent every anniversary since his attack, alone in his modest apartment, watching media coverage of the Foundation's accomplishments while confronting the magnitude of what his cruelty had cost him. He had lost his grandson, his daughter-in-law, his son, his business empire, his social connections, and his public reputation. Most importantly, he had lost the opportunity to be part of Michael's remarkable journey, and to witness firsthand the extraordinary potential he had been too prejudiced to recognize. The legacy that Thomas had tried to protect through his discriminatory attitudes had been completely transformed by his own choices. Instead of being remembered as a successful businessman who built a manufacturing empire, he would be forever associated with family dysfunction and discrimination against disabled children. His name would appear in academic papers, legal decisions, and policy documents as a cautionary tale about the consequences of attacking vulnerable family members. Michael's legacy, by contrast, would be one of hope, transformation, and the power of love to overcome even the cruelest rejection. His story would continue to inspire families, medical professionals, and advocates who understood that every child deserved unconditional support regardless of disability status. The foundation bearing his name would carry forward the mission of protecting vulnerable children while maximizing their potential through innovative treatments and family support services. The war that Thomas had declared on his disabled grandson had indeed been won, but not by the combatant he had expected. Michael's victory wasn't just personal. It was systematic, creating changes that would protect generations of disabled children from the kind of discrimination he had faced. His grandfather's moment of cruelty had become the catalyst for a movement that transformed personal pain into lasting protection for society's most vulnerable members. As Michael continued to grow and thrive, surrounded by family members and professionals who celebrated his achievements and anticipated his continued success, his story remained a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of communities to transform trauma into positive change. His grandfather's cruel words had been preserved not as a source of shame, but as evidence of the prejudice that love, advocacy, and systematic action could overcome. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.